Hello and welcome to this session discussing licensing Microsoft Azure Stack. My name is David Knappett and I'm an architect with Microsoft Services. The agenda for this module is first to review the Azure licensing model, and then I'll talk about the different Azure Stack licensing models of capacity and pay-as-you-use, as well as the different transaction models that are available. So first, let's review the Azure licensing model. With Azure Stack being an extension of Azure, it's important to understand Azure offerings and how they can be purchased and are billed to then understand how that relates to Azure Stack. The first consideration when looking to use Azure is what is being purchased and how it will be billed. So let's look at this at a high level. There are three main offerings for Azure. Microsoft Azure Services are a rapidly growing number of metered resources providing immediate access to Microsoft's cloud and the flexibility to increase or decrease usage according to business needs. With Azure Services, customers pay for what they use in arrears, with no minimum quantity or upfront cost. The Microsoft Azure Marketplace provides access to thousands of third-party products, all of which customers can provision in the Azure portal and which can be billed via most Microsoft volume licensing agreements. And Microsoft Azure plans are logical groupings of services packaged together as a solution. Plans allow Microsoft to provide predictable pricing in return for an upfront commitment or to sell a package of services that logically make up a solution. Plans include entitled amounts of Azure services. Once a customer decides what services or plans they want to purchase, there are three main purchasing options that apply to these offerings. Pay-as-you-go customers pay only for what they use in arrears. There is no minimum quantity or upfront cost. Monetary commitment customers allocate funds and pay in advance for Azure services on their Microsoft Enterprise enrollment. Customers can prepay for committed services and pay upfront for longer-term commitments to specific services or groupings of services. Azure plans may be right for customers who can estimate their usage and who do not have surplus monetary commitment balance to use. With Azure Stack, it's a similar story. There are services such as virtual machines and storage. There is a marketplace where items can be syndicated from Azure or custom items can be created, and Azure plans such as Azure Support are used. The monetary commitment can also be used for Azure Stack consumption as long as the subscriptions you use fall under the same enrollment. So let's talk about the capacity and pay-as-you-use licensing models, as well as a quick overview of purchasing an Azure Stack system. Azure Stack hardware is purchased as an integrated system available in several different configurations directly from a number of hardware partners, and this includes professional services to deploy Azure Stack, as well as hardware support provided by the hardware partner too. It's important to note here that Microsoft does not participate in the hardware selling process. And whether Azure Stack is used with capacity or licensing models, Azure Stack must be registered with Microsoft. Azure Stack services are billed by Microsoft via an enterprise agreement or through a cloud solution provider, and software support comes from Microsoft Customer Services via Premier or an Azure agreement. If you already have an Azure or Premier support contract with Microsoft, you do not need to purchase a separate contract to cover Azure Stack services. Your existing contract extends to cover Azure Stack at no additional cost. You will, however, still need a support contract with the hardware partner. I've just mentioned support in both sections here. The hardware provider will provide support on the hardware components of Azure Stack, and Microsoft will provide support for the Azure Stack solution deployed on that hardware. However, both Microsoft and the hardware partner will work together to provide an integrated support experience. The use of Azure Stack services can be obtained in two ways. As an end customer, the customer can purchase Azure Stack and pay for Azure Stack services via an enterprise agreement, and the relationship is direct with Microsoft. End customers can also pay for Azure Stack services through a service provider, where the relationship is with the service provider, and that service provider has the relationship with Microsoft. In this case, the pricing and packaging is set by the service provider. Specifically for service providers, the CSP program enables service providers to resell Azure Stack services to end customers, who then also own the customer relationship, terms, pricing, and end customer support. The first of the two licensing models I'll talk about is pay-as-you-use, which is also sometimes referred to as the consumption model. With pay-as-you-use, as the title suggests, you only pay for the workloads that are running on Azure Stack. If you were to buy an Azure Stack system and leave it running, there is no ongoing licensing cost. The underlying virtual machines and licenses that are required to run Azure Stack are not charged for. As with Azure, there are meters that track consumption. This is billed through Azure Commerce and uses the same subscriptions, monetary commitment, and invoicing as Azure, and as we touched on earlier, both EA and CSP channels are applicable for the pay-as-you-use model. Microsoft follows cloud-consistent licensing principles with Azure Stack in that there are only charges for services used with no upfront software fees. It uses similar units of monetization, such as the cost of a vCPU per hour, and Azure Stack charges are significantly less than Azure due to the hardware costs and other cost of ownership differences when compared to Azure. The costs for pay-as-you-use pricing are published at the link at the bottom of this slide, but I've listed the current pricing here. As you can see, there are no upfront licensing fees for Azure Stack, and then you pay for these items here: virtual machine cores, blob, table and queue storage, unmanaged and managed disks, and app service, based on what's used. As it says at the bottom of this slide, customers can bring their own Windows Server and SQL Server licenses to run on base VM images. For Windows Server, if you bring your own license, you can deploy VMs at the cheaper base VM rate instead of paying for the Windows Server license in the VM cost, but you must license the entire Azure Stack deployment. More information can again be found at the link at the bottom of this slide, and once there, click the link for Download the Pricing and Licensing Datasheet. In addition to the base functionality of Azure Stack, there are additional resource providers that can be added, such as for Microsoft SQL, MySQL, and App Service. In the pay-as-you-use model, there are factors that need consideration from a licensing perspective. For both Microsoft SQL and MySQL, any servers that are used for hosting tenant databases must be licensed appropriately, but the supporting infrastructure for the resource providers does not need to be licensed in keeping with the rest of the Azure Stack underlying infrastructure. In addition, there will of course be storage costs at the rates shown on the previous slide. With App Service, it's a similar story in that there are no costs for running the supporting infrastructure or licensing, but there are additional meters that keep track of usage and charged for appropriately. For on-premises licenses with Azure Stack, this table is a useful reference to help understand the correct path depending on whether the Azure Stack deployment is dedicated to a single customer or whether it's being used in a multi-tenant environment to host multiple different customers. As I mentioned earlier, Windows Server VMs deployed use either the native Windows Server VM image in Azure Stack, which is tagged with the hourly meter, or on-premises Windows Server licenses in conjunction with Azure Stack base VMs through the Cloud Solution Provider or CSP program, Services Provider License Agreement or SPLA, or Enterprise Agreement EA. SQL Server can also be deployed with on-premises SQL Server licenses in conjunction with Windows VMs through SPLA or EA, but please keep in mind that the use of on-premises software should comply with on-premises licensing terms, and so please contact a Microsoft licensing specialist for any licensing queries. To give an overview of the transaction models for Azure Stack integrated systems in a pay-as-you-use model that we've touched on previously, in an enterprise, the customer is the end user and they buy the hardware as an integrated hardware system from one of the hardware vendors, and the customer pays Microsoft for the use of Azure Stack and the workloads running on top through an EA. For a hoster or service provider, they again buy the hardware from one of the hardware vendors, and the hoster pays Microsoft for the use of Azure Stack and the workloads running on top through CSP, but then have their own pricing and service model to offer to their end customers, and we'll cover this in a bit more detail shortly. And on the right hand side here, in some cases the OEM may act as a service provider, and again have their own pricing and service model to offer to their end customers. And so to summarize licensing Azure Stack in a pay-as-you-use model as a diagram, start the conversation around Azure Stack and place an order with the hardware vendor. The hardware vendor comes and deploys Azure Stack in your environment with no additional licensing costs. The underlying infrastructure, such as the tenant and admin portals that run Azure Stack, have no additional licensing costs. For end-user workloads such as virtual machines, storage, networking, and Key Vault, there are no additional licensing costs, but meters capture what is used and for how long, and Microsoft charges the CSP or enterprise customer via these meters only for what is used. It's the same for other services on Azure Stack, such as App Service. There are no licensing costs, but meters capture what is used and for how long. Give consideration to the Microsoft SQL and MySQL resource providers. For the addition of the resource providers themselves, there is no licensing cost. However, the database servers that host databases require in-guest licensing. And then everything that is built on top of Azure Stack is subject to their usual licensing requirements in addition to their running costs. Now we've covered the pay-as-you-use model, we'll cover the capacity model. The capacity model can be used with an Azure Stack deployment that is connected to Azure, but it is not the main use case here, and pay-as-you-use will likely provide the best value. So for a disconnected Azure Stack deployment that has no dependency on or connection to Azure, the capacity model is used and there is no usage metering which is charged. Instead, there is a fixed fee as an annual subscription, which is charged based on the number of physical cores, and you must license all physical cores on an Azure Stack system. But this gives unlimited use rights for running infrastructure as a service components. Transactions happen separately to Azure, and you cannot use monetary commitment, and it uses different billing. And also, it's only available with the Enterprise Agreement channel. So there are two different capacity models available depending on what workloads you wish to run or offer. The first is the App Service package that includes running App Service, the base VM cost, and Azure Storage. What it doesn't include is any Windows Server or Microsoft SQL Server licensing for tenant workloads which require licensing separately. And we have the Infrastructure as a Service package, which includes the base VM cost and Azure Storage, but does not include App Service. Windows Server and Microsoft SQL Server licensing is the same here in that they require separate licensing. And as mentioned already, all physical cores of the deployment must be licensed. In summary, the capacity model is really not the mainstream case here and is for those customers that need to operate in a disconnected environment or have special regulatory requirements. As mentioned, the licensing is not transacted like Azure and cannot be transacted by CSP. The only option is an enterprise agreement. Metered usage or pay-as-you-use is not available, and it requires an annual subscription. There is no perpetual use rights option. Consumption does provide the best value in comparison, and the capacity model may be more familiar, but it's not consistent with the way Azure or other modern cloud-native services transact. So for the final section, I'll go into some more detail around the considerations for using the Cloud Solution Provider program for managed service providers with a pay-as-you-use model. This diagram shows the relationships and responsibilities for managed service providers in a direct scenario. The service provider holds end customer relationships, including billing and support. The end customer has an Azure subscription provided by the CSP, and Azure Stack tracks usage for each tenant separately, and this usage data is attached to that Azure subscription with the data transmitted to Azure Commerce. As a result, the customer's Azure Stack usage is shown and billed on the same invoices and through Partner Center tools, the same as Azure, and all CSP program incentives and rebates apply too. Many customers use Indirect CSP where there is a reseller involved as a managed service provider. This too is supported on Azure Stack, just like in Azure, and there are the same end customer responsibilities and subscription access rights are granted via Partner Center. For a reseller, the indirect provider owns and administers Azure Stack, and again, all CSP program incentives and rebates apply here too. Similar to the previous slide, the difference here is for a distributor or OEM scenario where the reseller owns and administers the Azure Stack deployment. Here, the indirect provider owns the Azure Stack registration and the admin subscription. The admin subscription has rights to administer Azure Stack and is used for tasks such as patching and updating the Azure Stack deployment, as well as onboarding tenants. As a cloud solution provider, as a direct CSP, or when a CSP distributor is managing the usage and billing for Azure Stack, The use of Azure Partner Shared Services, or APSS, subscriptions are the preferred choice for the registration of Azure Stack. This acts as an umbrella for each customer to then have their own CSP Azure subscription, and the tenants get added to the provider's Azure Stack registration for the separation of usage to the relevant subscription. The process for adding a new tenant for usage and billing to Azure Stack in this scenario is to first create a new customer in Partner Center, then create an Azure subscription for the end customer. If the end customer will manage their own account, create a guest user in the directory. The administrator of Azure Stack then updates their registration with the end customer subscription and onboards that tenant to Azure Stack. And then finally, the end customer can create resources in Azure Stack. And that brings to an end this session on licensing Microsoft Azure Stack, which I hope has been useful. Thank you very much.